Hi guys, so welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use the useCallback hook from React and as well as the React.memo hook. So the useCallback is a hook and the React.memo is a function used to memoize a component. So by memoizing, what we mean is that you prevent the component from rendering unless it's supposed to. Because in React, most cases, you might create a component that re-renders unnecessarily. So we're going to talk about that. So to get started, I have a question for you. So did you know that JavaScript creates a new function with the same declaration and name, but still it's not the same function? So if you have two functions in JavaScript, this is what I'm reading. So you have two functions in JavaScript and the function is not quite similar to a similar function. I know this sounds crazy, but in JavaScript, a function is an object, and a new object is not similar to an existing object that is quite similar. So this is what I mean by that, because here we have the function on the left is function fn console.log hello, and then we have a similar function on the right. So in JavaScript, these functions are not identical. So why does this matter? You might ask, why does this matter in terms of React? So in React, we want to prevent a child component from re-rendering unless its props change. So, but now we are met with this scenario whereby we do have a function we are passing down to the child, but now this function, during the next render, this function is not similar to the first function. So this is the issue we are trying to solve. So as illustrated above, a new function but similar is like a key clone on the master key. They might be identical but not similar. So imagine this scenario, you have a master key and then you go and do a duplicate key, but still the duplicate key is not similar to the master key. So what does this have to do with the useCallback function? You might ask, why? So the useCallback function hook, it's the useCallback hook. So I need to edit this real quick. So did you know that JavaScript creates a new function with the same declaration and name, but still it's not the same function? Okay, so we have an issue. Where was it? Okay, so let's get back to the tutorial. So what does this have to do with the useCallback hook? So the useCallback hook helps us cache a function, and this function, it caches the function in such a way that during the next render, it gives you the similar function. So since here we say this function is not equal to the left function, when these functions are wrapped, this function is wrapped inside the useCallback hook, you get the same function. So this prevents the child component from rendering, because now this function is similar and it cannot re-render if the function is similar. So sometimes in React, you want to prevent a component from re-rendering unless its props change. So when you pass a function to an optimized component, the component receives a different function on each render. Hence, the optimization does not work. So take a look at this function component. So we have a function called sum function, and then this function is passed down to a child component that is optimized. So the memo function is used to memoize a function, which means it caches the functions and only re-renders this component when the props change. So this component just has one prop, which is the sum function. And now, as we said earlier, that during a re-render of the parent component, since this is optimized and it should only re-render when the props change, we get a new function. So we do get a new function on each render, which when the memo comes here to compare the props, it defines as a new prop and it renders the component. And this is not what we want to do. So if you continue to read, a component wrapped in a memo does not render unless the props change. But in our scenario, in each render, we get a new function, which means the props have changed, but they have not in real sense. So to get around this, that's where the useCallback hook comes into play. So this hook caches the function and returns the same function unless now its dependencies change. So we have some function, you use the useCallback hook, then pass it the function you want, the function body. So some function, you wrap it in the useCallback, and then it gives you back the same function during re-renders, which means during the next render, the sum function will still be the same function we had previously, unless the dependencies change. So the child component will not re-render because we do now have the same function that we had previous. And then the memo function that is wrapping our child component. And as I said, so the memo function's job is to cache the function, this function, and re-render it only when the props change. So our prop is a function. So by using the useCallback hook, we prevent a new function from being created unless now the useCallback's dependency changes. But since we don't have a dependency, this means that this function will be cached indefinitely. It won't change in that case. So if it doesn't change, then the memo here checks and does not render the child component. So you might think the child component might have a heavy tasks going on. Okay, so now we go to the useCallback syntax, and then finally we wrap up with the points to note. So as always, I do have a component here. So this is my entry point of my React application. This React application is running on Vite. So then I have a component called useCallback explained that I'm rendering in my app. So if you go to the useCallback explained, this is what we get. So we do want to start with the syntax of the useCallback. So to use the useCallback, the first thing you need to do is to import it from React, and then to use the useCallback hook. So let me, even before we start with this, let me call this parent component. Parent component, then we create another function here called child component, which returns maybe a h1, says hello. Okay, so we said let's create a function here. Maybe this is the submit handler. So const submit under submit is equals to, we want to create this function. So this, let's assume there is a form here, there is a form in the child component that as soon as you submit it, it should call the parent and notify it or that. So here what we need here is we get the handle submit and submit, which is a function that returns void. Then maybe here we can have a button. So I'm assuming this is a form. We can say submit. One click. Then we call under submit. Okay, so and then here we render the child component. And then pass the handle submit function. So we have said to memoize a function, a component. Let me just use a functional component. So this one is a functional component. So yeah, so this was readable. We just said during the first render, this function gets created. During the next render, this function gets recreated, and it is not similar to the previous function. So here we have a child component that takes in a prop of handle submit. So where is the issue? The issue is that when we memoize this function, so we import the memo hook from the memo function from React. What this memo function does is it prevents the function from re-rendering unless its children or its props change. Okay, it prevents re-rendering unless its props change. So which is the prop of this child component? The prop of the child component is called the handle submit function. And I have said during the first render we get the handle submit function, and then since we did not have the handle submit function, this renders this component. During the next render, we do have this handle submit function is recreated, and now this one causes an issue because whenever it is recreated, it demystifies why we were memoizing this component in the first place, because the function has changed. So this one will re-render, but in essence this function has not changed at all. Okay, so this is where the useCallback comes into play. So you call the useCallback, wrap your function body into it, you give it a function, and then it takes in two arguments. The first argument is the function, and the next argument is the dependency array. So what does this help us achieve? So the use callback will return a memoized version of the callback that only changes if only one of the inputs have changed. So that means, so the dependency, you just list them. So dep, maybe you have a variable called cost my dep, set my dep. You can use a use it hook. So let's say we do this, my dep. So my dep console.log my dep. So I'm assuming you're going to use the my dep function, my dep value, not just console logging it. And then to add the dependencies, we add my dep as a dependency. So this is the syntax. So that's the syntax. And then now here is a big question. The use callback caches the function or memoizes the function and gives us the same function unless these dependencies here have changed. So in case you don't pass the dependency, it caches the function indefinitely. So it means it will not throw away the value. Point to note, the use callback hook does not cache the value but caches your function. Let me repeat this one. So during the first render, it will give you the function you just provided. And during the next render, it gives you the previous render's function unless the dependencies change, in which it provides a function you provided during the current render. So that being said, that means our handle submit function will not change. So if it doesn't change, the memo function sees that the prop has not changed, and in turn it does not cache it does not re-render this component. Okay, and that's it from the use memo. The use callback hook. Nothing new, just that. And that's the most common use case of the use memo, the use callback hook. So if you go back to our docs, the key points to note is that the use callback hook is a hook and should only be called on top of your component and not inside loops or conditionals. However, if you need this functionality, you extract a new component and use the use callback inside. Next, the use callback does not call your function. So you remember, use callback caches functions and returns the same function to you so that you can decide what to do with it. It does not call your function. It is used to cache a function and not to call it. During the first render, it returns the function you just provided. During the re-render, it returns a cached function from the previous render if the dependencies did not change, or gives you the function you provided during the current render if the dependencies changed. Okay, the use callback hook is an optimization technique. Only use it when you reach a performance bottleneck. For most apps, it's not needed. So what is the relationship between the use callback and the use memo? So the use callback is used to cache a function. It prevents the creation of a new function, whereas the use memo is used to cache the return value of a function. And both have a dependency array which determines whether, on the use callback, whether to provide the function during the current render, or in the use memo to recalculate the value. So you can also use this optimization technique whereby the use memo function or the use memo hook is used to cache the return of the computed product requirements, and which is provided here, and the handle submit function is cached using the use callback hook, and both are provided to the shipping form component. So that means unless the products change, this component won't re-render because the requirements is similar. So the requirements here is computed and it's cached unless the product changed. The handle submit function is cached unless the product ID changes or the referrer. So unless those two change, this component would re-render, which is an optimization technique. In conclusion, we have checked out that the syntax of the use callback hook, how it memoizes functions. So the use callback memoizes functions, whereas the use memo caches a value, the return value of a function. So the use callback takes in a function, and the function can take arguments, whereas the use memo, it takes in a pure function that does not take arguments and returns the value of calling it another function or a value in that case. And they both have the dependency array. And then, as I said, the React memo is a function that basically memoizes a component. Memoizing a component, you wrap the component inside this React.memo function, and this prevents re-rendering of the component unless the props change. And that's it from me, guys. Happy coding. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to promote it, and see you later. Thank you.